This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this Planet Hoster webinar with Derick. We will talk about a lot of good tips. Thank you, Derick, for joining us. Thank you for your availability and giving great tips to our clients, our auditors, and all the people that will use our platform or other type of PHP applications. So, Derick, I'll let you start. It will be recorded. If we have question at the end, it will be a pleasure also to answer. Uh, I think Derick will be able to answer advanced questions, and we Planet Holster as a team, we can also answer if there's particular questions on Planet Holster side. So we can start. Derick, I'll let you start the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Mina. Yeah, by the way, if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to click on your raise your hand button kind of thing in the lower left, and I should be able to spot that and maybe pull you in if you'd like to, or otherwise you can ask a question in the chat as well. I'll keep an eye out on that as well. So hi, I'm Derick. Oh, hang on. Hi, I'm Derick. I'm European. I'm Dutch and British living in London. I've been involved in the PHP project for a long, long time, and I am/was PHP 7.4's release manager. PHP 7.4 and PHP 7 is no longer quite maintained anymore. So I'm no longer the release manager. During my day, I work basically on two different things. I work for the PHP Foundation to work on the PHP language itself. And the other time, I work on Xdebug, the debugger that I'll be talking about today. I like maps, beer, and whiskey. That is irrelevant for this talk, but I thought I'd throw that out regardless. If you have any further questions, you can find me on Mastodon and also sort of on Twitter, but I don't really pay a lot of attention to that anymore. But let's get going here. So Xdebug 3 is sort of what I want to talk about a little bit as an introduction, but then also further about all the new things that have recently been added to Xdebug, as in Xdebug 3.1 and 3.2. But I thought it'd be useful to show a little bit of a concept of how Xdebug actually works, what it does, and why it is the way it is. So with Xdebug 3, I started introducing modes. So before Xdebug 3, basically all the features in Xdebug were always enabled. And if everything is always enabled, it makes things really, really slow, which is not great because you want your code to run quickly, even sometimes if you want to do debugging or profiling. So with modes, you can tell Xdebug which things need to be enabled. If you set a mode to off, then Xdebug remains loaded, but it has minuscule overhead, which is kind of handy if you run it in a production environment. I saw that on the Planet Hoster demo application, Xdebug is loaded there. It's moded set to develop, which means it creates some overhead, but I'll show you in a moment how to turn these things off when we're having a look at that. And then beyond off, there is develop, which is what produces the nice orange messages and stack overflow checking, as well as the overloaded vardums that Xdebug has, as well as a bunch of other things. This is the default mode. It's always enabled if you don't make any changes yourself. Then there's the debugger, which is a way how you can step through your application. I will show you later in the demo how that works as well. Then there is tracing, which allows you to, for the whole duration of a request, to write to a file exactly which lines of code have been run. And also, if you want to, you can have all the variable assignments as well as the return values dumped in this file as well. I don't really have the time to show you that today, but it is actually a really interesting way of discovering how an application works if you've never seen it before without having to single step through it. Excuse me. Then there's the profiler. It allows you to see which bits of your application are being slow for a single request. This is quite a useful feature to have, especially if you know that if you want to make some optimizations to applications yourself. Then there's coverage, and coverage is used for telling you which lines have of code has been run during a request. This is usually used in combination with things like PHP units, which can provide you with test coverage, and Xdebug provides you with both line coverage, which lines have been executed, and optionally it can also do branch and path coverage, which then tells you which paths to the function you have followed. And what I mean by that is, like, if you have an if statement, then that creates two paths because the if statement can be either true or false. Similarly, if you have a while loop, there will be multiple paths through the code. And with path coverage, Xdebug in combination with PHP unit and PHP code coverage can then tell you which paths have been followed during the test, meaning that you can write better tests to cover more of the paths that you have in there. And then the last one I want to talk about is time traveler mode. Time traveler mode doesn't really exist yet. I've started working on a prototype for that. And what time travel allows you to do is to dump the states of every step throughout the execution of a script, and then later play this back like you would do with a debugger, so that you can single step through code while it is no longer being executed. And this file that is being created works a little bit like a tracer. It has variable assignments in them, there's return values, function calls, and also the source code. So it's a great way of being able to tell somebody, like, enable this feature in Xdebug. It will then create a file after requesting a page through your web server, and then you can ship this whole file and then use that yourself for debugging an application, without you having to run a debugger on a live production environment, for example. Now, Xdebug 3 also has a whole bunch of configuration settings. I won't go through all of them, but if you want to know which settings they are all nicely documented in Xdebug's documentation. A few to highlight here is there's Xdebug mode, that's the one that I've been talking about. There's output there, which configures in which directory you'll get your trace files and your profile files, for example. Then there is client host and client port. These are used for the single step debugger. The demo that we'll be doing in a moment doesn't really make use of these because I just use the defaults. And there's a whole bunch of other things in here too. If anything goes wrong, you can turn on the log file and set the log level to 11 so that you can then see everything that Xdebug is trying, and I'll show you a little bit of that in a moment. The other big thing about Xdebug 3 beyond the modes is also performance has been increased significantly. After I'd done all my split ups, like I said, into the different modes, I took a baseline, the one here, and then I started looking for specific optimizations for different features. So that means that over the course of a few weeks, the profiler became about 40% faster, and many of the other features about 20%. But compare that to what Xdebug 2 did, and you can see that the performance of many features in Xdebug has increased significantly. And I'll be doing more work to work on this and to do that even better, of course. All right, so how can we now have a look at what Xdebug 3 actually has? So I've added a few features as well that make your life for figuring out what happens or what Xdebug is doing easier as well. So Xdebug info is a bit like PHP info, but then for Xdebug. And I shall demo that. Give me a second. So I have this one loaded here on my, apologies, I still had the debugger on. So this is basically loading a PHP file that has the following in it. It has basically PHP OpenDeck and then Xdebug info, just like you have PHP info, for example. And what it produces is a page like this. It is a page that says you in the top which modes have been enabled. So it says here they're enabled through the xdebug.mode setting, and there's the development helpers are enabled as well as the step debugger. If you click on this icon here to the right, that goes straight to the documentation for these features, exactly how to use them and things like that. It then talks about some optional features, which we won't cover today here. But then below there is a diagnostic log, which is kind of useful because it tells you exactly what Xdebug has been trying when it is connecting to through a debugging client. And again, if there's other errors or warnings or something that goes wrong in Xdebug, there's a link to the documentation here again. And if you open these up, then it has a whole section here telling you when this error happens, why it happens, how it looks like, and also a bunch of suggested solutions. And for each of the warnings and errors that Xdebug shows in here, it has a section here in this documentation, making my life a lot easier because it will tell people how to do their own things. Now, we can also do this on the Planet Hoster environment. So I have that loaded here. So this is the demo site. Oh, demo site, where'd I go? Come on. The demo site here. I can see that they're using a slightly older version. Maybe time to upgrade soon, but that's okay. And it also tells you exactly the same thing as would load locally. You can see here that the development helpers are enabled, but the step debugger is not. If you want to do that, you can actually do that on their machines by logging into the server. So if I log in with my username and password, I've added this extra thing here, which from Linux creates a SSH tunnel to the machine, making that can then be used to create a debugging connection back to. So let me just do this, log in, and then open the PHP ini file. We search for Xdebug, and then we can add xdebug.mode in here, and I set that to develop, debug. I'll save the file, and now if I reload it here, yes, reload is here, and now it doesn't work. It worked when I just tried it out. I don't know why this doesn't work now. Let's save it, right? I do not know why this doesn't work now. What you expect to see is that it now says enabled in the step debugger. I don't want to go live debugging why exactly that doesn't work because I don't know that platform very well, but I'll just move on and do the demos on my side for now. All right, so Xdebug info is kind of useful to figure out what's going on here. And yeah, it's over the newer versions, I will add more things in there to tell you exactly what's going on. Now, there's a few other things Xdebug info can do if you give it an extra argument as a string. And I'll have that in my demo here. So for example, if I do Xdebug info with mode, it will tell me which mode there is. And if I do Xdebug info extension flags, it will tell me some information about which features are enabled in Xdebug itself. So if I now reload this, you'll see that it tells you which modes are enabled. So there's the debug mode and the develop mode as you expect, and that file compression is also one of the flags here. Interestingly, Xdebug also shows you a link to a file number here. But unfortunately, because I run this in a different container, or if you run it on a different server, these file names don't necessarily match of what you have locally, and therefore you can't really open them in your IDE because in this case the file names don't work, right? So I have no var www HTML on my machine. That's just what it uses on the server. Instead, to make these things work in the step debugger, you need to set up path mapping, which I'll show you in a moment. So the last thing that, oh, come on, switch. So that's Xdebug info, which is kind of useful. And then the last thing that I've introduced is Xdebug notify, which allows you to send data over the debugging protocol that shows up in your console. This does not work with PHP Storm yet. They haven't implemented the feature, but it does work with the VS Code debug adapter for PHP. So let me start the debugger and demonstrate this as well. So I'll comment out the ones I already had. And I will then do Xdebug notify. And in here, I basically send a whole array of information. So basically, I set what Xdebug mode is and what the flags are, for example. Now, for this to work, I need to start the listener here. And I do that by clicking on this listening icon. And then if everything goes well, it should show somewhere here what the result of this is. So go back to my example page. Just set finish, that's good, because that's what we expected. And here in the debug console, it says indeed an array of 2, because we have an array of 2 elements in here that has then a modes and flags in it. Unfortunately, by default, the PHP Storm, the VS Code adapter only allows for 2 nested levels. So I can't really show you the information yet, but I'm working with the people that make this debugger adaptation for VS Code to make this work better in the near future. I mean, if you really want to see all of this in there, you can, of course, do this. And then you should get a string doing that. So let me demonstrate that too. I reload the page. And then you get it again, we have an array of 2 in here, and then it says mode debug, develop. So it does know what to do here. Okay, let me stop listening for the debugger and continue with the slides. Now, I've already showed you the file link format setting. The problem is that, as I mentioned, that the files don't always match on a server, on a hosting provider like Planet Hoster, or sometimes also in Docker containers or in other remote machines where you have development, for example. So at the moment, there's not really a good solution for this yet, because Xdebug itself doesn't know how to translate files or file paths between remote and local machines. But again, I'm working on this as well, because this is a feature that is useful for many other things as well. So I can't really demo this because it doesn't work. So there's a few other things, like if you have ever worked with Xdebug before, there's sometimes a few frustrations in there, like if you set breakpoints, for example. Now, let me open PHP Storm in this case and open a file to show you how this works. PHP Storm, we don't need this file. Pick a different example. Oh, still has some breakpoints set from earlier runs. For example, if you'd set a breakpoint here on line 5. So line 5 has no code, but PHP Storm can't really know where sometimes PHP generates code at. So if I set a breakpoint here on this line 5, you would sort of expect that a breakpoint never gets hit. So let me go to start listening for debug connections. And we need to remember the file name, static properties. So if I go to my browser now, then the breakpoint did do something, because this is still waiting to go anywhere, right? So if I now go back to the IDE, it has stopped here on this first line, which makes sense because what I've enabled is break at first line. I shouldn't have done that. So let me run the script. And run this demo again. So again, I have the breakpoint set on line 5 here. Reload it in my file. And you now see that actually the breakpoint is moved to line 6. So this is a new feature in PHP Storm. The VS Code adapter already had this for a while. And PHP Storm also shows you this big warning here saying the debug session was suspended here because the breakpoint at static line 5 was resolved to this position, which is line 6. And then it tells you that you can disable this feature or leave it as it is. I suggest you leave it as it is, because it's actually a really useful thing to do. And the way how this works is actually what Xdebug is doing is, like, if PHP enters a function with breakpoints in it, it will actually scan which lines have actual code on them. And if the line on which a breakpoint is set does not have a breakpoint on it, or does not have code on it, it will scan to further lines to find then the first location where there's actual code. And in this case, that being line 6, where the static is being run. So this is a new helpful feature. So let me stop the script, because we don't have to debug anything else here, and go back to the slides. Now, if you actually want to know how this works under the hood, you can actually check the log file. So the log file, you remember that I showed you the setting xdebug.log. I already done that on my local environment. So let me go back to the command line. If I go to logs directory, you see this xdebug.log file in there. And if I showed you how big it is, it's only 1.4 megabytes, but I've just started it. If you actually look into this file, there's a whole lot of stuff in here that isn't very relevant. Let me go to the start of my last setting here. So the first thing it actually shows you in the log is exactly in which ways Xdebug decided to start a debug connection to begin with. So it says the first thing is it checks if the trigger Xdebug trigger is enabled for the mode debug. And it says it isn't found, so falling back to Xdebug session. And Xdebug session is the way how you can enable debugging through browser extension. So I didn't show you that, but I've installed a browser extension, which you can see right here, which sets these cookies for me automatically. So that means that the debug always ends. Now, it then tells you what it's trying to connect to. In this case, I'm running something on Docker. And then you can see the rest of the thing as well. The interesting things here is that it sets breakpoints. So this is something that is set by the IDs received by Xdebug. And it says then the line number 5 is in the smallest of range, 4 to 9. That's the function body. But it also says that the line 5 doesn't have code in it. And then it figures out that the line 6 is set, and then the line after that, it sends like this notification to tell the IDE that it actually has resolved it to line 6 here. And it does that for all the breakpoints. Also, interestingly, if you set breakpoints, on all the bits, all the breakpoints are set even though you might not actually be running these files as well. And then further on, it actually shows you when it is running, whether a specific file and line combination matches the location of a debug. Now, I wouldn't recommend you have this on all the time because it creates a large file, but it's really useful for figuring out how the debugger gets started and also diagnose problems with it. Now, the thing that I often hear about is that sometimes if you have like a fluent interface, and what I mean by this is I will show you actually. A fluid interface is something like this, right? Where you have like the shipping info object with a bunch of private properties, and then I have functions that do this customer name, and then we return this, right? The methods aren't particularly very interesting. So when you then use it, you do set customer, set address, set city, and set postcode. But it is really hard to debug this because Xdebug can only stop in between statements, and this is considered one statement. So what Xdebug 3.2 adds is return value debugging as well. And I will show you how that works. So this is the Fluent file. So I'll open that in my browser. Oh. Helps if I spell that correctly. So it stops here at the breakpoint immediately. And now when I do step over, it steps over as you would expect. So there's nothing, it steps over to the next line in the code. However, there's something different if you do a step to the next line. So let me show you that as well. So let me re-request the page. Stops here again, and now we do step into. So you see shipping info is not set. We set customer, we called it, and then return this. So return this now. There's a new line here in the output of a PHP store, and similarly this also works with VS Code, is that you now, the return value of this shipping info set customer call, after this object looks like this. So we have set customer name is Derick Rethans because that's what I called, but the others aren't filled in yet. We can also do that for subsequent calls. So we do set address. Similar thing, it shows you the result after that. Set city again. This extra step is actually in between returning from the function and the assignment. And this is a specific state in Xdebug which PHP Storm sort of hides from you, where it isn't really possible to see the values of the original function that were called, or the functions in the global scope, but PHP Storm meshes these together, which is kind of nice to do. Similarly, I have here a strlen function that calls something on toString, but I do this immediately with a return without pre-assigning it, but I can still capture what the result of strlen is by stepping into, that is a toString, and you get the result of toString as a argument to this function here, which is really nice as well to see. And then if I step in once more, apologies, you can't really step into internal functions because they're written in C. But what happens in this case, it then shows you the return of count letters again. Unfortunately, it can't step into strlen or do anything with it because that's unfortunately how PHP works. But in any case, this is how return value debugging works. I found this a really useful feature, which lots of people have asked for ages. So I'm now glad to report that this is now in Xdebug too. Right, back to the slides. That's just on. Now, the sometimes an ID sets breakpoints on non-existent files, and so I'll actually show you how that works. So I will stop here, PHP Storm, go to VS Code, and you can see here that we have a bunch of things set, right? A bunch of breakpoints set. Now, if I go into the browser back to this info file, sorry, I do need to set a breakpoint here. Breakpoint. Go to the browser, go back to my info file. It's finished because I forgot to listen. Let me listen. Request. And now it sits here. Now it should sit here waiting. Why doesn't this work? Well, I can maybe set it on line 2 instead. So let me refresh this. And again, nothing really happens here, right? What's going on here? My breakpoints are gone. What if I set it on the first line? Refresh. Again, nothing happens here. So the reason why nothing happens really is because I haven't set up any path mappings. So because files running on the server are in a different location than locally, the debugger doesn't work. So in order to make that work, you need to configure the path mappings here so that you can match the remote paths, as I have here, to my local path so that the ID can translate between that itself. So I'll need to stop that and listen again. And now I would expect that if I reload this page, it then stops at the breakpoints. Although it also tells you that some breakpoints could not be set. And why would that be? Well, let me go Xdebug info. Let me enable that as well. I will run the script, reload it again, then finish it. And then basically what it says here is that the debugger was active and it all worked just fine. So there we go. However, I'm getting a bunch of errors here, and that is basically because it tries to set breakpoints on files that don't exist, which is kind of a nice way of figuring out that something is going wrong here because of the different file and paths here. Although it says there's no problems here, but that's a lie, as you can tell. So anyway, this is how breakpoint resolving works, and path mappings, which are important if you do any sort of remote debugging. It will then also tell you if files don't exist and you set breakpoints on that, which is useful to know. So the last feature for debugging I'd like to show is connect to client. This is a feature that is useful if you have like a long running script. And what I mean by that is the following. So I have a worker manager file. Let me open it in the IDE as well. File. Actually, let me do that in PHP store. Worker manager file. Open it up. And pretty much what it does is it has a while true loop, and basically it does a task for every iteration in the loop. What the task is at the moment basically sleeps for 1 second, then returns me a random number, and then prints it out. So if I run that on the command line, you basically see a new random number every second. But now I have this started, how normally, because Xdebug only makes a connection at the start of the request, so if I run this, run it, and if I now would go to listen mode, then nothing would happen because the script has already started, so we cannot debug the script now. This is where this new function Xdebug connect to client comes into play. Basically, it's a way for instructing Xdebug to attempt to make a connection to an IDE if none exists yet. So we pause this or abort the script. Now add this function back in the mix. Start the script again. Oh, sorry, I should have stopped debugging. So now the script is running, right? And if I then go to suddenly start listening for debug connections, it stops here automatically because Xdebug connect to client is now active, and because it could connect, because Xdebug could connect, it then does the breakpoints, which means now I can just debug as normal. So I can sleep for 1 second.
De toute façon, moi, quand je suis à la mer,
I'll just continue. So actually, if you might not have seen that. Oh. So even if we have a built-in PHP function here, random int is a built-in function. If I step into that, which you shouldn't be able to do for a C function, we will still see the result of it, which is in this case is random int. So even though we can't step into these internal functions, we can still use the return value debugging as well. In any case, if I'm now done running this script, I can click resume program, but because we have no further breakpoints, that will then just stop at the next breakpoint, right? So that's not particularly very useful. But what is also possible is to click the detach from session, which is different from stop. Stop will mean that you abort a script, whereas detach from session will instruct Xdebug to disconnect from the IDE and then continue running. So let me click that now. Oh, what happens now? Because the IDE is still setting in listening mode, the next time Xdebug connect to client is called, it then makes a new connection. So for this to work, what you really need to do is while you are debugging, go to stop listening for debug connections and then click detach. And now, because we are not listening for connections, the script will run on the command line, as you can see here, until I then enable again, start listening for debug connections. And then it stops as soon as it can. So this Xdebug connects to client is like a nice way for debug these long running scripts here, which is, well, I think pretty useful to have. Okay, now I shall abort the script and then it will also stop immediately on the command line. So don't use that if you want to run more of these tasks later. In that case, make sure to use the detach, which has now disappeared because no debug request is running. Done that. Now, sometimes in some situations, it is a bit tricky on what host names to use for to tell Xdebug where to connect to. So the way how debugging works is that it isn't your IDE connecting to PHP/Xdebug. No, it is Xdebug making a connection to your IDE. And for that, you need to have sometimes more complicated network setups. If you run things in Docker, for example, you might have seen this host.docker.internal, which doesn't really work on Linux because you have to make extra configurations in Docker. But what you can now do in Xdebug 3.2 is you can set this xdebug://gateway as a host name. And then you need to prefix that with xdebug:// to distinguish it from actual host names. By using gateway, it basically then instructs Xdebug to connect to the IP address of the current network gateway, which in Docker is usually your local machine where your IDE runs. So that's then the right address automatically. And that works on Windows, OS X, and Linux. The other one is namesaver, which is used for running Xdebug in WS2, where sometimes it's really hard to figure out what the IP address is, and this will then go around that and then connect to the name server that is configured for Linux running in WS2. And in that case, that also means the right IP address to connect to where your IDE should be listening to outside of WS2. Talking about networking setups. So in the most normal situation, PHP Xdebug and PHP Storm, the editor, run on the same machine here. But over the times, networking setups have been becoming more complicated. Sometimes PHP and Xdebug run on a different machine than your IDE, which would then require network connection. If you have things like Vagrant or VirtualBox or Docker in the mix, then there's an extra networking layer around here as well, making this setup harder to do. And sometimes you have a firewall in the way, which means you can't even make a connection between those two hosts. So I worked on a process/program called Xdebug Cloud. I know the video says coming soon, but it already exists, which is actually allows you for doing debugging where both Xdebug as well as your IDE connect to a standard IP address, and then that sets up the debugger connection, which is actually really useful because it means that you don't have to create a network connection from the server where Xdebug runs to your IDE, and in some situations you can't set it up. Now, I know with Planet Host, the documentation says, and this works if I know how to enable things, how to you do that with an SSH tunnel. Let me refresh this once more to see whether something has now loaded. No. Oh, there we go. I don't know. It took some time for the step debugger to get enabled. So let me actually demo that now. That's the wrong one. Okay. There we go. So let me actually now log into the machine. And the way how an SSH tunnel works, it basically instructs the remote area to open a port and forward that to my localhost and port number. In which case, that is the localhost and port where my IDE runs on my local machine. So interestingly, if I now refresh this page, will it make a debug connection? Let me make sure I'm actually listening. Nope, you're still listening, so that's good. So it actually says it doesn't do anything yet. It hasn't even attempted it because it says no messages in the diagnostics log. Now the way how to get around that, I mean, on my local machine, I use that with my debug extension, but there's other tricks as well. So if you do an Xdebug session start is one, it actually instructs Xdebug to make this connection. So I did it now with a get URL, but it also works with post and cookies. And then what happens actually in my local environment is that PHP Storm is now confused because this info file that I have on my remote file, I don't have a file for that locally, right? Because I haven't copied over all the source files on the demo here. But if you have all the source code locally, what you can do is you can set up this path mapping the home with your username on a remote machine to a local path, and then you can do debugging, although Xdebug is running on your host with your ID that you run locally. Similarly, if for some reason you can't set up SSH tunnels, you can also use Xdebug Cloud to do something similar by configuring a cloud ID on the server side as well as locally, so that they can communicate. I won't be able to show you that now because we're running slightly out of time, but that is also possible. Okay, what else is happening? Xdebug is open source. Some businesses help me running Xdebug, which is great. If you want to do that, let me know. Come and talk to me. But I always find it important to show that what I'm working on. So on my website, xdebug.org/log, I will show you exactly how much time I spent on different features. At the moment, as you can see, I haven't managed to spend that much time on it due to other commitments, but it looks like from the second half of this year, I'll be working on some nice new features, including the time travel debugging that I've been talking about, probably working on rewriting the profiler to make it faster and more correct in some cases, and perhaps some other things as well. If you have any suggestions or ideas, I'm happy to hear them as well. I think it's now time to take some questions. So if there are some in the chat, now is the time to ask them. You can either type them or raise your hand and I'll make you live. No questions? Minna, do you have one?
I always have questions, but
Okay.
I think we will create a post on our forum in order to receive all the questions, to be able to answer also, because answering code questions by a webinar, it's harder than just copy paste or just provide a written code.
That's certainly true.
So we will make public the recording in our forum, and also create a post in order to receive all the questions, the written questions. So thank you, Derick. It's always a pleasure to hear you. I learned some tricks today, so thank you. And we will share it internally as well for the team and all the clients that would like to review the webinar.
Okay, I actually have a question for you. When I prepared this, I edited the PHP ini file on your server, right? And it instantly refreshed in my browser. Why did it not do that this time around? Is there some cache involved or something?
Indeed, we use some proprietary solution for the caching, so that might cause the small. It's not a glitch. It's not a bug. It's a feature. Usually, people want the website faster, want the application faster. So we use some caching and other type of solution to provide this type of performance. And indeed, when you try to change a little thing in the code, it might trigger the cache. No worries. We will have a small option to disable it in our panel N0C. It will be a pleasure to make things better, and we always work to make things better. So thanks, Derick, for the presentation. It was a pleasure, and we hope to invite you in another session after we receive a lot of questions in order for you to be able to add new things. And we will follow you on Twitter. We'll follow all the projects that you will release. We will update all the version also internally on our infrastructure to meet the latest things. So thanks a lot. Always a pleasure. And thank you everyone for joining us.
And thanks for having me. I will actually put the slides online as well, but I haven't done that yet. I'll come later.
Thank you.
And yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.